Been told a scary story that you need 1 million, 2 million, or even $3 million to retire. And those numbers were designed to do one thing, and that's basically promote fear and make you feel like you lost the game already. But what if I told you that these numbers were the biggest myth in finance and they just create a narrative that you're just going to be working forever and you're never going to be able to retire? In this video, I'm going to talk about some simple steps that you could take right now to help eliminate that fear. But before we can get to those steps and talking about, eliminating the fear, we got to identify the problem, right? And then we got to expose the myth before we can start taking steps to do something about it. When you hear that you need $1 to $3 million, be honest, how does that make you feel, right? For most people, it probably makes them feel paralyzed, or it kind of makes you feel like you're just way behind, you're never going to catch up, and like, I shouldn't even do anything because it's just not going to even matter. And if you feel this way, you're not alone. There was actually an organization, I think it's called Alliance Life, that did a study that found that 67% of people were more concerned about running out of money than they were about death. Now, that's crazy fear that you're putting into people about, saving for retirement, that they're more concerned about, money than they are about actually dying. And when you have the headlines, either on YouTube or on the news or wherever that are constantly telling you this, that you need this $1 to $3 million to retire, it's just pouring gasoline on the fire and just making people feel even more anxious and more anxious each day. But here's the fine print that people don't read. And that's, your retirement is not based on the average American. It's based on you as an individual. What you need for retirement may be different from what the next person needs. So to me, just giving this, advice that you need $1 to $3 million, to me is like kind of silly because, with personal finance, as I always say, it's personal. So now that we've identified the problem, then let's start busting a few myths, right? Of why this $1 to $3 million number is probably wrong for most of us. And the number one myth that we need to bust is that, you think that you need your pre-retirement income. And that's just not true. That's just a big misconception that a lot of people have. And there are going to be things that, when you're in retirement, you get older, that are going to disappear from your budget. Number one is that you're not saving for retirement anymore. You're not saving for an emergency fund anymore. You're no longer raising kids anymore, because by this time that you reach, retirement age, your kids are probably grown and out on their own and probably finished college and are making a living for themselves. So, and even if they are living at home, it's not like you're taking care of them the same way that, you did when they were little. In addition, you can make them pay rent at this point in time because, they need to learn how to take care of themselves. But you also are not paying those, payroll taxes that you pay on your earned income, like when you were working your job. And as far as your job, you're not commuting anymore if you're retired, right? So you don't have the cost of gasoline and you don't have the cost of having to buy a new car as often, right? Because if you're not driving very much, then you're probably going to pay off your car, and you're probably not going to need to get a new car as often. You're going to probably have that same car for a much longer period of time, and that car is going to be in much better shape for a longer period of time because you are not commuting. And for another group of people, they're probably going to have their home paid off and they're not going to have a mortgage. So that is another thing that they are going to be able to eliminate from their budget. And I know for me personally, I sat down and just started looking at my budget and saying, man, if I was not raising kids and it was just me and my wife and, we had to take care of ourselves, then, like, what would our budget be? And honestly, man, I calculated at least, $4,000 to $5,000 that we could basically eliminate from the budget if we were in retirement. Because again, we're not saving for retirement. We're in retirement. We're not saving for kids' education. We're not consistently building an emergency fund and all of these things. So that would just go by the wayside, as well as not having to feed, 5 people. Now it's just 2 people. So that's a big dip in your grocery bill. So for me, it was saving about $4,000 or $5,000 a month. And that's what's wrong with this myth, right? Is that a lot of people believe that they need to maintain, 100% of their pre-retirement income, when that's just not the case, right? From the studies and everything that I've read, people need about 70 to 80% of their pre-retirement income if they really looked at it and start, subtracting out the things that they will no longer be doing, in retirement life. And, to me, obviously it's going to be different for each individual, but that seems like a fair assessment, based on, me doing my own calculations, looking at my own family budget. So it's not about, maintaining this same lifestyle that you were in pre, retirement, right? It's about funding the life that you're planning to lead going forward. And if you can do that off of 70 to 80% of, your pre-retirement income, then that's great for you. You go on and live your life and be happy. The next myth that we want to bust is that Social Security will not be there. I know we've been hearing this forever and forever, that, Social Security is going to go away. And I personally do not believe this, especially, if you are someone in your 40s and 50s, or even in your 60s and already, receiving Social Security. I do not believe it's going to go away. And that is because it's never going away. Because politicians love their jobs, they love their positions, and the individuals who would go out and, basically eliminate Social Security probably would not be in office any longer. And we all know that politicians, within, our government, are selfish individuals, and they are not going to do something that, gets rid of their job. So even if you, and not to be political, but even if you look at it and say, if there was a party that was going to eliminate Social Security, you could probably say it would probably be the GOP, the Republican Party, and probably not going to be a Democratic thing, because they want to provide benefits for everybody. But I would say I don't see that happening with the Republican Party, because they lean heavily on the voting population that's 60 plus. So if you go and eliminate Social Security, what are you going to do? You're going to eliminate all the checks that these old people who vote for you receive? Then they're not going to be voting for you anymore. You do the same for anybody who's nearing retirement age, who's in their 40s and 50s. Sure, could there be some changes to Social Security to where benefits get changed? Sure, I believe that that can happen, and it's probable. But more than likely for people that are further away from retirement age. But the idea that you're not going to have zero dollars in Social Security benefits coming to you, to me, that's just kind of absurd. And I think it's just a fear tactic that people throw out there. And it's just a myth that I think if you're in your 40s or 50s, you could probably not think that that's going to happen. And this last myth that I want to dispel is that you need a certain number by a certain age. You see it all the time on YouTube, different videos where financial experts are talking about the number you need to have by a certain age, and by 40 you need to have 700,000, or by 50 you need to have 1 million, and blah blah blah, right? And to me, that's all just made up nonsense. It's a myth, because going into like my late 30s, I believe my net worth probably was around $100,000. So you're talking about a guy who's approaching 40, with just $100,000 net worth. But by the time I exited my 40s, that 40 to 50 year period, I came out and I had a net worth, over $1 million. So this whole myth that you have to have, a certain amount, by a certain age, it's not true, because your journey is going to be different. My journey was different, right? I didn't understand certain things when I was younger, but once I figured them out, man, I was able to take advantage of certain opportunities with my money, and was able to significantly grow my net worth. So I know for a fact it's a myth that, you have to have a certain net worth by a certain age. And I've been able to, double that net worth, right, over time. So it really doesn't matter. It's based on you and how you go out and implement your investing strategy and so forth. And there's no age that's assigned to that. So now that we busted a few myths, let's talk about what can we do right now to put ourselves in a better position so that we're not out here stressing and going on a wild goose chase for this $1 to $3 million, because again, we may not need it. So step one is find your annual spending. This one should be an easy one, right? Because we all should have a budget of some kind. And that budget is going to show, hey, this is the income that I have coming in. These are my annual expenses. These are all the things that I plan and do annually. And there you have it. That is going to be your starting point, your annual spending. So for step two, we're going to estimate your retirement spending. So you're going to take your annual spending and you're going to adjust it, right? And you're going to start subtracting out the things that you are no longer going to be having to spend money on. For example, you're not going to be saving for retirement in the same manner, right? So you can subtract that from your annual spending. You're not going to be putting money away for your kids, 529 plan. So you can subtract that from your spending. You may not have kids in the household anymore. So you can subtract that spending. You may not have a mortgage payment anymore. So you can subtract that payment. All of these different things that you are not going to be incurring anymore in retirement, then you can just basically zap those away from your budget, because you now need a new budget, right? It's your estimated retirement spending budget. So it's going to look much different than your pre-retirement budget. Now, one thing that I do want to point out with your estimated retirement spending is that you also have to add in things that you plan to do in retirement that you were not doing, pre-retirement. So if your goal is to travel more, then you need to make that adjustment in your budget to add back in additional costs for travel and so forth. So most people, take vacations still, even with, pre-retirement. So there's probably some level of vacation money that's in your budget already. But again, if you want to bump that up in retirement and travel more, you need to adjust that in your estimated retirement spending. So moving on to step three, right? So now you want to look at your reliable income, and your reliable income is going to be things like whether you have a pension, or if you have some sort of annuity that you're going to be receiving, long term throughout your life. Also, you want to go to the Social Security website, and from there you can get an estimate of what your benefit would be based on your individual situation, your individual contributions, and so forth. And your spouse could do the same as well. And then from there, you both can calculate what your reliable income is going to be over your lifetime. This is basically money that you're anticipating that you're going to be getting, for the rest of your life, perhaps, that it's your base floor, right? It's before you have any other investment, money that basically you saved and invested that is going to be funding your retirement. And then you can move on to step four, which is sort of obvious, I guess. You're going to look at your estimated retirement spending, and then you're going to look at your reliable retirement income. And then you're going to put those two numbers together, and then you're going to see a gap, right? That, okay, in order for me to get to my estimated, retirement spending, I'm going to have to fund a certain gap that's between those two. So for example, if my estimated retirement spending is going to be $10,000, and I'm just using round numbers here for ease of understanding, right? And my reliable income in retirement is $5,000 through, let's say, Social Security and a pension, then I have a gap of $5,000. And my other investment, savings and so forth, will need to fund that $5,000. So that's what I'm talking about, estimating your retirement gap. So in the final step, then that's where you have to basically take that, retirement gap that you came up with And that is what you are going to build, your savings goals around, right? So based on, hey, if you're saying that I'm going to retire at 65 and I estimate that, I'm going to live to, whatever years it is, you're kind of using that type of information to estimate, what, uh, your savings goals need to be, what your investments need to be generating, so forth, to get you that $5,000 gap that we talked about earlier that you have. So that's really an individual thing, right? Because your lifestyle is going to be so much different from the next person's lifestyle. And what you're planning to spend in retirement is going to be so much different from what the next person is planning to spend. I know I used $10,000, and that's a high number for the majority of Americans. um, so that was just for the purposes of doing an exercise, right? But it's going to be basically up to you as an individual to figure out how you're going to meet your savings goal, and cover up that gap. And the beauty of it is that none of this stuff is just like set in stone or static, right? You can adjust as you go, as you live. You may be, in early retirement, you might be spending a little bit more, and then something happens, man, you can stop spending anytime you get ready, and then maybe you pick it back up later when things are rolling well, and so forth. So again, it's all based on the individual, and I believe that there is a lot of flexibility in how people can choose to retire and manage their retirement. And it's not just all based on, you got to have $1 million, you got to have $2 million, you got to have $3 million, and so forth. So in closing, this myth that you need $1 to $3 million, in my opinion, I believe that it is destructive to most people, because number one, most people are never going to get there. Most people are just simply not going to, get to, $1 million, $2 million, and, even less will get to $3 million. So when you tell people that that's what they need, in order to have a comfortable retirement, you kind of take the soul from people. You take the hope from people. And that's why I think that it's destructive, because for every individual, their situation is going to be so different. Because, a person who has Social Security and a nice pension may not have as much saved, but they may actually, have more than enough money in retirement to go live a very comfortable life. So look, that is all I have for you in this video. If you took something of value, please like, share with your friends and your family. And in the meantime, take care of yourself and be safe out here in these social media streets.